I would say we start. Good afternoon, hello, and a very warm welcome to today's HIIG-Spotlight, where we will discuss how innovative education forms can help prevent polarization in society and this way strengthen our democracy. This meeting will be recorded, so consider this when asking questions, and I encourage you to take part in our discussion and to share your comments and questions. You can use the chat. You can raise your hand at any point of the discussion. I will keep an eye on it and I will try to react as fast as possible. So my name is Nataliia Sokolovska. I work here at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, and I lead the research program Knowledge and Society. And what we mainly do is we focus on questions around societal relevance of research and how society and academia can interact. And today's discussion was mostly inspired, or better to say, triggered by contemporary political transformations across Europe and across the broader Western world, and particularly the results of the last German election as well. And it clearly shows that among the youngest voters, so among the so-called first-time voters, there is a lot of support for the extreme ends of the political spectrum, for the left and for the right. And what we will be asking ourselves today for the next hour, I guess, is how do we prevent further polarization in our society? What does polarization mean? Why is it a bad thing? And what can we do actually to prevent it, particularly among young voters and by using education and research? And this said, I very warmly welcome our guests. And hello and welcome Wander Jager, who is the managing director of the Groningen Center for Social Complexity and a professor at the University of Groningen, and Stefano Braghiroli, who is a professor of European study at the University of Tartu. And my first question is addressed to both of you, and it sounds like this. So I'm wondering why are we actually drifting apart, and what are the underlying social dynamics driving this growing division in society?
Well, that's a very nice question. Thank you, Natalia. Uh, I would like to say that we are very sensitive for observing that we are driving apart. Uh, but probably it's not as bad as a lot of people think, because there's also a lot of people having middle positions, and very often you don't hear them that much. And in particular with social media, we are more likely to hear about the more extreme opinions, and that the more moderates are often not that well heard. But it is, of course, a concern when in a public debate, mainly the more extreme voices are being heard, because obviously that can have an impact on the whole of society.
Stefano, would you like to add anything, and would you like to start
Uh,
the
yeah,
discussion maybe also by briefly introducing yourself, because I just only mentioned your names and institutions.
yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Stefano Braghiroli. Indeed, I'm associate professor of European Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. I've been there for quite some time by now, 12 years, and I'm originally from Italy. And maybe, yeah, then I can follow up a little bit to what Vander said. I agree that maybe we should look at when it comes again to divisions in society at let's say the glass maybe more half full than half empty. The problem, however, is that exactly because, let's say, divisions and what triggers division tend to be more heard and sometimes even to some extent hype more than it actually is, there is a sort of contagion effect. So to some extent, if we feel the society is polarized, we tend somehow to be drift into it if we don't act. And I think this is also that what we are gonna basically discuss more during this debate. Maybe I want to bring in just a couple of points. The first one is coming again from a background in political science, comparative politics, is the idea of identity politics. I think that identity politics is a factor that to a large extent contributes to our society feeling drifting apart. I don't like very much the word identity politics. I prefer, let's say, the idea of identity instead of politics. The point is that politics, if you really look at the root of what it means, comes from the polis idea. So somehow the idea that we take care of the affairs of the city, of the polis. Now, to some extent, when we put identity into politics, it's not anymore that we are debating about ideas. What are the better ideas, the best ideas to do something? So not what is better for me or what is better for us, but more like who I am. And very often this who I am is seen through who I'm not, and very often tends to become, if let's say it's pumped by ideology and pumped basically by political entrepreneurs, a binary choice. And this is when we see, for example, this kind of, to trickle down into culture wars and so on. The problem indeed is that if the debate is not about ideas or policies, but about identity, it's much more difficult to change. Identity is a thing that is much more complex to change in our understanding than policies or ideas. And somehow, if I understand that the opposite side negates who I am, that somehow triggers division, and I feel that I need to put up defenses and somehow protections. And when this basically trickles down to levels of politics, institutions, politicians, parties, then of course somehow affects the whole society.
Vander, you've been studying social dynamics for many years and modeling opinion dynamics. What is your take on this? Is it really a discussion we're having about identities? And what would you say from your perspective as a computational social scientist?
Well, usually the models that we are working with are quite simple, but they help in reflecting about the dynamics taking place in society. And Stefano's remark on identity, I think, is spot on. What I usually say is that we deal with a lot of complex, multidimensional challenges in the world. Think, for example, about issues around climate change, about migration, the wars that we have. These are all situations that involve so many different perspectives, so many different dimensions. It's very difficult for people to grasp the complexity of it all. So what we often tend to do is to basically boil it down to a single dimension. And when you put a very complex situation on a single dimension, you end up with a situation of them versus us. And guess what? Us, we are usually good, and the other one is usually very evil, right? And that's a process that I like to call Walt Disneyification. Because in a typical Walt Disney movie, you have the villain. Within 5 minutes, you know who the villain is. And the villain is just bad. And you don't need to listen to that person because they are bad. They're utterly evil. And I think when you look at modern politics, in the public debate, there's a lot of people responding in that way. They're just considering the opposition as being very bad. And I think that's very concerning. On top of that, what you see is that a lot of people seem to connect the position that they have with their personal identity. And that means when they engage in a discussion, that arguments against their position are being experienced as an attack on their personality, making it very emotional. And I think this is one of the challenges that we faced in our civilization to grow over this kind of behavior. And I hope with some educational material we can add a little drop to the hot plate in cooling ourselves a little bit down.
So before diving diving more into the educational material and into the innovative approach that you're actually working on in one of your most recent projects, I would like to get a feeling more for how you assess the situation and what's currently happening. It's currently happening in the Western world and in Europe particularly. So it's often said that during crisis, this setting them versus us and this the good ones versus the bad ones are actually deep is actually strengthening, and that people just tend to support more decisive political forces. And would you agree with this? And how do you see has the process changed if you, for example, compare the political landscape now and 10 years ago or 20 years ago in Europe?
Maybe I can start with that. Well, I think that the big problem when, let's say, we are in times of crisis is that people naturally feel more insecure, feel somehow more vulnerable. And to some extent, this also connects to the fact that the real or perceived sense of crisis also is a reflection of a perceived or real failure of, let's say, our elites, our governments, our basically institutions, and so on. And that, of course, opens up very much spaces for demagogues, opens up basically for entrepreneurs that plays with politics of fear. And of course, let's say, this is also when people tend to be much more inward looking, and somehow to speak more to people they can relate to, and somehow to live in a bubble. Now, maybe two things on this, which I believe are factors that tend to make these dynamics much more tangible and much more visible. And this is where maybe we see a difference from, let's say, 10, 20 years ago. The first one is, to some extent, the decline of the idea of community. The idea somehow that the community itself becomes increasingly divided into small groups, into in-groups that somehow are more relatable, instead, let's say, of a community in which, let's say, there is diversity and in which, let's say, ideas compete with each other. And this, to some extent, relate to what I was discussing before, identity politics. The other one, of course, is the idea that the environment in which we interact has changed quite a bit. I mean, here I put just one point instead of many. I mean, think, for example, of the traditional media environment vis-a-vis the one in which much more fluid, for sure less elitist, but also much more open to strengthening and deepening division rather than somehow blending them. And this is basically where we see that these dynamics again set roots, and that naturally polarization increases because of that. And again, maybe last point on this, when we are in times of crisis, to some extent, we remove our natural, let's say, rational defenses, and we tend to be much more emotional. Let's say, if the mainstream solutions we feel that they don't work, we are much more open to experimenting. And again, this, of course, can open path to, let's say, entrepreneurs, political and not only political, that play with these dynamics.
And you're both working with students and with young researchers, and you kind of can observe both how they form opinions and attitudes, like on a personal level, also from a research level, like by studying dynamics, studying the history, and you mentioned, Vander, that there is that you believe that education can make a difference and that can somehow influence this process. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think first, I think it's important when you understand these kinds of processes that it may help to self-reflect on how you respond to certain situations. And I would like to build a little bit on what Stefano just said about fear. And I think related is anger. I think that is very important in current society. this is also what we show our students. We recently did a simulation model, Tang Li and I, on COVID. You remember COVID, right? And how polarized society got on that. And we showed that, in particular, fear plays a very important role in driving people apart. When people are afraid, their acceptance for opinions that are deviating from their own is getting lower. People become less tolerant.
Mhm.
Now, if you know that, then you can also see that there's a lot of uh, fear mongering going on, and there's a lot of material that can make you afraid. And in particular, the social media, I sometimes call it the asocial or anti-social media, is of course brilliant in showing all kinds of footage of things that are emotionally very touching, making you angry and making you afraid. Uh, just think about for example, the attacks that take place in Germany on innocent people. It's obvious that people get angry and afraid of that. But the impact is that people become less tolerant for deviating opinions. So this contributes by itself to separation of the people. And I think becoming aware of these mechanisms may help in becoming aware of your own responses to that kind of footage. But I hope that we can contribute a little bit to it, but we have to be aware that we are dealing with very fundamental emotional responses that we have as people. And ultimately, we are hunter gatherers that are now operating in a global network setting. And it's difficult for us to grow a culture that is capable of dealing with this kind of overwhelming emotional footage that is basically uh, provided to us. That's a big challenge.
And so you mentioned that there's a lack of understanding of the underlying dynamics and the underlying logic of polarization and what it actually means. And that is a lot triggered by or backed by fear. But what can you actually do against this fear? Can you limit the fear if you show how the mechanism works, or what exactly did you how do you cope with that?
Uh, that's a very interesting one, and I'm still studying on that and reading a lot about it. But it seems that we as humanity always are tempted to follow people who tell us about terrible futures, but only if we believe them, we're going to be safe. History is basically packed with examples that people collectively go in a very uh, uh, dangerous direction because they thought this is the only way out. And also today, there's a lot of people preaching about the end of the world because of migration, of climate change, or whatever reason. And people are basically very sensitive for this kind of information and becoming afraid. And of course, the media uh, is very interested in giving the floor to these people because they draw a lot of attention. When you preach out that it's even worse than we thought, oh, that's newsworthy. Uh, if there's any news, oh, actually, ladies and gentlemen, it's not that much of a problem. That has less impact on the news. So I think that's also a dynamic that plays an important role here. And the challenge is not only to teach about that, but to create a kind of mental hygiene in people of how to digest this information. But this is really a tough one.
So you're both working currently on a new project, or more or less a new project that is called Anti-Polarization Learning Experiences for a Better Democracy. And you are developing a number of educational resources that are supposed to help countering polarization processes and do exactly what you just talked about, Wander, and raise this awareness, give the understanding, and show how manipulative such social discourse can be if it is too polarized. Maybe could you tell me more about what you are currently developing in this project as an educational resources and how it relates to your previous work? Maybe Stefano, you could start. You're muted.
Sorry, here I am. Yes, indeed, we are developing as part of Actiplex a set of tools that are addressing especially young people in order to kind of trying to show them what Vander was mentioning before. So not only what polarization is and let's say what are the effects of polarization, but what are the mechanisms of it. And in a way, by exposing the mechanism, by opening the black box and seeing basically what, let's say, perverse dynamics are behind the idea itself of polarization, to kind of debunk it. At the moment, we are finalizing. We are, let's say, I would say, at a good process of development of an online course. Which basically is focused on a topic which has primarily to do with urban development and how basically, let's say, the debate between two individuals about the future of their city. So to some extent, let's say, go back to the very idea of what politics is, relates to the dynamics of polarization and how basically, let's say, we can discuss ideas without engaging into a very polarizing environment. One interesting thing, maybe just here, I also want to share with the ones that with the ones that are listening to us, is that to some extent we had quite a bit of discussion about how to find a topic that could be, on the one hand, engaging enough, but at the same time not create polarization by itself. So making students and young people and participants experience, let's say, the intensity of a discussion. Let's be very fair, making hearts beat, but at the same time, not, let's say, by touching the topic, increasing naturally polarization. So this, I would say, is what we are working on now. And maybe just one thing about let's say, what I'm broadly working about and how that relates to that. One experience that I had in the past, before the European Parliament elections, I was teaching a course called European Parliament elections, and students somehow had to familiarize with the dynamics and so on. And one idea to kind of put in practice what Vander was saying, so exposing others to even ideas that they don't like and making them engage with that, I basically told students, pick the party that you like the least. And then basically one of the final task was to have a political debate in which they were supposed to be kind of candidates for the different parties. And this means that they had to understand the logic of parties they didn't like and be able to motivate those positions, also not agreeing with them. And actually, after the exercise, I heard from many students that although obviously they keep not liking those ideas, now they understand better why people might be supporting those ideas. This also helps them to talk more and better to people that are not the problem, but let's say to try basically to discuss ideas and not people and identities. So yeah, I would say that I stop here.
Yeah, so basically this is you model a situation and you give your students the possibility to experience it from the other side of the spectrum, so to say. And we actually have a question on identities coming from our participants, and it sounds like this: is connecting politics to one's own identity entirely new, or has it just been amplified in recent years?
I mean, I can start. I think that politics has been, to a large extent, or to some extent, always connected also to identity. So it's not something completely new. I would say that the problem, however, is that when identity itself takes over, let's say, the debate on ideas, and moreover, identity becomes binary, either this or the other. First of all, it becomes very difficult to reconcile one identity with the other. And again, then there is really the risk that it becomes a dynamic that triggers cultural war. The other thing is that when politics, and this is connected to identity, doesn't debate only about ideas and also how we see ideas, how they affect us, but it starts really to talk about the fundamentals, which means values. And we might find out that we share very little values with certain other components of the society. Then this basically problematically trickles down at the level of politics. And then we might end up questioning, for example, the very foundation of our democratic societies. So to some extent, it's not a matter of not bringing identity into politics. The problem is when identity is turned into politics, to some extent, the risk is that we basically throw away the baby with the dirty water. And for example, I give you just one example, which is very directly connected to Germany. One of the things that you learn from the book, anytime you approach the German political system after World War II, is this idea of constitutional patriotism. We are Germans and we belong to the same country, not because of the blood that we have or where we come from, but because we share and somehow we belong to the same spheres of values. And this is basically what makes our constitution, what makes our democracy. The moment in which these values are no longer agreed but challenged fundamentally, then the very question is like, when will they somehow trickle down at the level of democracy? When somehow institutions that we take for granted in terms of guarantor of democracy will be challenged. And that, of course, becomes a fundamental question, not only for Germany, but I would say for most of the modern advanced democratic societies.
And following up on this, and how have these what's the effect of media? Because we have another comment in the chat that maybe social media has deepened this effect, and we speak also a lot about the changing standards of a public discourse, so to say, because it wasn't that accessible in this pre-social media time for any anonymous user who has any opinion or any strong and very critical, inappropriate opinion. Does this have any effect on polarization? What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, maybe Vander, you go, and then I follow up. Otherwise, it seems.
Yeah, I do think so, because the same very nasty discussions took also place in the past, and I know some personal anecdotes here from our town Groningen when it in the 1970s decided to go towards some system of banning cars as much as possible from the inner city and creating more space for cyclists and pedestrians. And there at that time were also the Nazi arguments were being used. It was pretty nasty and very ugly, but it was basically between people. It was not being shared on social media and creating this kind of self-amplifying mechanisms of spreading, and making even more people angry. So I think in that sense, social media, also with its capability of sharing very emotional footage, has created a situation where it's much easier to become angry or become afraid. And I think that's something that we have to learn to cope with as a society.
If I may chip in on this, I completely agree with what Vander said, and I maybe connect two things. One is what he said before about the traditional medias. We have moved to a phase in which even traditional media somehow are primarily about, let's say, attracting visibility. I mean, let's say it sounds very bad, but basically clickbait. And somehow clickbait is generated by, let's say, amplifying what triggers people. These are normal medias, or what have become of normal medias. Social medias, again, they are not neutral environments. We are learning this more and more. They are environments that somehow are based on dynamics, on somehow choices, but basically of algorithms that somehow imply that certain things are amplified, others are not. So in a way, the problem of social media is not social media itself, but let's say what type of direction social media gives to debates and to discussion. And traditionally, social media flourish in, let's say, high level of contraposition. We see that, and let's say the effect can be double. One is that social media increases clash, not discussion, but basically in fight. The other, in fact, the other effect is that social media triggers you to basically live into your own bubble to avoid those clashes. And both sides are bad because simply you cannot have a normal conversation. So either it becomes a fight because that somehow it increases the interaction in the social media, or you live in your own bubble and you don't talk to the other side. Maybe one thing that I always take with a pinch of salt, but I think to some extent helps us reflecting, is a quote which I'm sure many of you have in mind by Umberto Eco. I even found it to be sure, let's say that I'm quoting correctly. Again, social media gives legion of idiots the right to speak when they once only spoke at a bar in front of a glass of wine without harming the community, but now they have the same right to speak as a Nobel Prize winner. Now, sounds very elitist, and Eco was well known to be elitist. At the same time, let's say the fact that every voice counts the same, and that somehow every claim has the same status, that somehow create problems when we discuss about ideas and when we discuss about policies, for example, because it doesn't become anymore about, which argument is more valid, but what I believe and what I don't want to be questioned.
Mm. And so coming back to the educational games, what you mentioned, Stefano. So as far as I understand, you basically try to raise awareness and among students and empathy, because you give them the possibility to experience something and to experience what the counterpart believes in. And I was wondering, so from your perspective, it should prepare the future kind of participant, or those who participate in political debates, to understand kind of what they do when they see these clashes on social media, what they see a discussion like you said was talking about, Wander, in your home city about a relevant topic that is on the agenda. And let's elaborate more on this game-based approach. So, Wander, when I look at what you are doing in your online courses in the classroom, you're playing around a lot. So you're playing with digital simulation. You're basically developing, let's say, computer games for the classroom, so people can experience also polarization, experience social dynamics, just in a different way. And can you maybe tell us more about it, and what do you want to show by bringing these digital simulations into your classroom to your students, and what would you like to achieve with that?
Yeah, okay. It's very nice to tell a little bit about that. My background is social psychology, which is basically the study of group behavior. Um, but the problem was that it's very difficult to experiment with large groups of people. You cannot bring them into a laboratory. Yet we are dealing with phenomena indeed like polarization and transitions and tipping points that are very interesting to study. Now, for that, a methodology has been developed, which is called agent-based modeling, which is basically building artificial societies in the computer world and trying basically to translate psychological theory in the rules for these simulated people. And now you have a platform to experiment with a large group of people. Of course, it's a model. Never trust a model, but you can learn something from it. And in the beginning, we were very much focusing on understanding certain processes, but later on, we realized how important it is to also use this kind of methodology to inform the general public about dynamics taking place in society. So we are now focusing on making these models more accessible for lay people and to make them such that it's easy to play around with them. So you can experience it yourself. And the latest developments that we have, and this in the project of Actiplex. And just to plug it, if you want to know more about it, visit socialpolarization.eu. You can find the development of the material over there. Yesterday, we have, for example, been playing with a water game where people are having a glass of water, and how much water is in it is expressing how much you are in favor or against a certain position, left or right. And now we can let them play around with them and exchange water according to certain rules. And yesterday, we, for example, demonstrated that if people are very intolerant for different water levels, that ultimately they ended up in a situation with a few people having no water and a group of other people having the glasses completely full. So they experienced how the process of polarization worked, and they were a little bit flabbergasted about, hey, what is happening here? Yes, this is a social dynamic process. And once they have this aha alertness of, hey, we grow into such a situation, then you open the discussion about the processes behind it. And I think what Stefano was also mentioning of the exercise of taking the position of somebody who's radically different from your position also is a very playful way of getting away from your fixed position and starting to look at the processes, how you end up in a certain position. And I think that's all kind of material that helps in creating experiences for people that help them to reflect on the on these kinds of processes and their own responsibility in that.
Mm. Maybe you could clarify a bit how the game works. So you have a classroom full of people with each one holding a glass of water, and what happens when they meet? So they have maybe you could tell about these tolerance level and discussion levels that kind of clash, and how this works. Because this is we're not talking about the digital modeling anymore. We are
No,
talking
no,
about
no.
in class like analog games.
Yes,
And
this was
also,
basically running a computer simulation on water. That
yeah.
was basically the idea, how to make it. And there's another one with paper clips and paper. So it's very nice to think about how to make it as simple as possible. But the basic idea here is if you meet another person, and if you can establish how different is my position from the position of another person, and in this case, it's the level of water that you have in a glass, then you can decide upon the difference what to do. Are you motivated to become more equal, or are you motivated to make the difference larger? And we can basically give people instructions, for example, if they are not tolerant, for example, because they are fearful or angry, then a little difference is already sufficient and becoming motivated to make the difference larger. Whereas if you're very tolerant, then a moderate difference will be perceived as, okay, this is tolerable, and you will be motivated to become more equal. Now, that's a simple rule, and this is sufficient in having a very playful situation, and you can create a situation that indeed you have a very extreme polarized situation, but you can also end up with a situation that everybody has an equal amount, which is also a concern because when you discuss about democracy, you have to realize that a diversity of opinions is the ecological system that you need to be adaptive for changing circumstances. So these kinds of exercises are very helpful in reflecting on democracy in a very playful manner.
So I see some discussions in the chat, but I'm not sure that I can follow them completely. So if you have questions, and I'm missing these questions in the chat, please feel free also to raise your hand and just ask it. Stefano, these tools developed by in this Actiplex project, particularly the in-class game, so the analog game and the digital game. So you will be using it, you will be testing it in your own classroom. And have you had any experience with similar tools before? And what do you expect to experience yourself?
Well, first of all, I have to say yes, and we are quite excited about that. In terms of using this specific tool, I have to say, and I say that with joy, that is the first time that I do it. I mean, I've been conducting simulations, role games, debates, defending one position versus the other, but this is quite new. I have to say that what I really like about this is that, as Vander said, yeah, you start from position which might be similar or different, then debate and discuss how similar or different they are in terms of water levels, right? Now, the point is that what I really find fundamental is that here the point is not whether the glass is full or empty. So we are not talking about, a binary division, full or empty. We are talking about shades of more full or less full, more empty and less empty. And this is exactly how we build I would say, healthy discussion in a democratic society. Because as Vander said, debate, discussion, even clash on ideas is basically the fertilizer of every society. Without that, you really don't have a democratic society. What is important to stress is that, again, we might agree or disagree, but what we should always stress that there are shades of agreement and disagreement. What we should try to prevent is basically the absolute black and white, let's say, division on many issues. Maybe just one thing. I think that while we talk about water and degrees of agreement and disagreement, what will be interesting is also to debrief with students and try basically to deconstruct what we have, let's say, discussed in terms of levels of water agreement, disagreement, and try to reflect it on, let's say, broader set of issues that we debate. And maybe last thing, this is not specifically even about this exercise, but I think that, once again, if the idea is to show to students and to young people and to people in general that it's good to debate ideas, even the ones that you don't like, I think that our classes definitely should be, let's say, safe spaces. They should be places where students feel comfortable and safe, but they shouldn't be sanitized spaces where we avoid discussing what we don't like. I think it's important that we discuss also what we don't like. And I think it's important that students sometimes feel uncomfortable when they discuss things that are uncomfortable in societies. Because if we don't do them in class, if we don't discuss it in class, the moment they get out of our classrooms, they will find things that are not only uncomfortable, but they are extremely damaging and extremely, let's say, dangerous for our social coexistence. So it's important we manage to deconstruct that in a safe environment to bring that out positive energy into the society.
Mm. And can you share some success stories or positive experience that you made after that you had after these after having these games in your classroom? So maybe how do you evaluate your or when do you know that your work has been successful, that it's such a game or an in-class workshop or this modeling that you also do, when is it successful? What do your students tell you about it, or what do you kind of observe in their discussions afterwards?
I'll start very briefly, and again, when it comes to the specific exercise that we'll be doing in Tartu, maybe I gave the word back to Vander. But I would say that really a good indicator is the type of discussion that students tend to have. And this applies basically to different scenarios, both simulation of decision making and debate of ideas and so on. we have a quite diverse and multicultural and classroom with students from pretty much all over the world. And very often we discuss issues of politics, geopolitics, that can be very close to them. Some of them come from conflict regions. Some others, let's say, have very different ideas. And, you know, in a way, since we create an environment in which people feel comfortable to speak, generally the way it works is that the discussion starts with people, I'm not saying screaming to each other, but they can be quite intense. Now, and the first reaction is that they tend to speak to the ones that share and agree, share the same idea and agree with them. However, if you manage to find a way, which again is relaxed, let's say non-pushy, but let's say to make them discuss with those that are on the polarized opposite side of them, what you see is that over time, if that is done properly, and I think this is where university school has a huge role, if that is done properly, they will start talking to each other, not screaming anymore. They might not come to a point in which they agree with each other's point. That's not even the final objective, but they recognize the legitimacy, or at least they recognize why someone else can look at the same issue in a different way. And I think that this is really the fundamental here. And this is also what we would like to replicate, let's say, from the safe space of a school or of a university into a society.
Mm. What about you, Vander? So after a 1 hour workshop or game-based workshop with water showing how polarization works, after your students were walking around and talking to each other and basically playing a game, and
Yeah,
how do you what do you hear from them in the end, and how do you see that if they have changed their attitude toward polarization, and if they have gained more awareness about how it works?
one of the best indicators, which is very difficult to quantify, I think, is the surprise on their faces when they see the emerging of a polarized situation. It's really, huh, what's happening here? We're dividing. And if this comes as a surprise, it gives a very nice situation to start a discussion. And I, I agree with Stefano. It's the quality of the discussion, the reflection that takes place that is very critical in developing this perspective on these kinds of issues. But what I also often try to emphasize is that, you know, we as humans, we are very sensitive for difference.
Mm-hmm.
And similarities very often go unnoticed. But if you take the stance of human needs and you ask people about, well, what makes you happy in life? I tend to believe that most people are happy with basically the same things. So ultimately, it's also important to realize that we are often fighting over the road to happiness, not about what happiness itself is. And I think that there's some uh, happiness to be found there that we share sometimes more than we think.
Mm.
And I think it's also very nice to reflect on that in these kinds of discussions.
Yeah.
Maybe can I just add one micro thing on this?
Yeah, sure.
I very much agree with what Vander said. So basically, that let's say we tend to be happy with the same things. So one, for example, way to kind of try to overcome maybe even polar differences between two of us on a specific topic is, let's try to see if maybe we agree on many other things. If we agree on many other things, it's then much easier to find what components of those other things can also allow us to talk about the other topic. The problem is that, for example, what we see in certain type of very polarized politics at the level of parties and political entrepreneurs, that they try very much to, let's say, create overlapping dividing lines on different topics, because it's much easier for political entrepreneurs to act with a very divided set in which they can easily identify the group they relate to and define all the others as somehow in terms of enemy logic.
Mm. We have a question in the chat, and it sounds like this: how do how can we approach people on a topic if they are not open to challenge their position? And should it be about more about emotions or about finding common topics? So you partially addressed it already, but do you have maybe anything to add on it?
Maybe one thing. The first one is that if they don't agree on one topic or they don't want to talk about the topic, let them talk about, as I said, other topics. And in this way, then they can find already some degrees of commonalities. They might somehow get more close to each other and understand. Basically, they can also talk about something else. That's basically the story that we have seen increasingly in the US. And what is increasingly suggested, we have two political fronts that don't talk to each other about politics. Let's talk about basic things. Let's talk about, again, what Vanguard said makes us all happy. The other thing is that maybe this is the moment in which, when it comes to the topic that is very polarizing, we should try to leave a bit our emotions aside. I know it's not easy to say, but the point is that if we go back to a point, let's try to argue in terms of rational arguments, at least what we understand as rational arguments. It's much easier to, let's say, understand what is acceptable to me and what I understand in the same way as you if we talk about, let's say, rational or potentially rational arguments, rather than if we bring everything in terms of emotion or emotional charge. I'm not saying that we need to drop them completely, but that would be maybe a good way to try to de-escalate the tension.
Hmm. And what if you're not a student anymore and you're not part of a university, but you still would like to find out more about your educational resources and about the digital simulation and the game-based workshop? Is there any possibility also for this group of people to find out more and to experience what you have to offer in this sense?
It's all open source, so everybody can use it. And I think that's also very important for a project like this. That is a clear example of also university projects reaching out, perhaps even taking a bit of responsibility. So that's what we do.
Yeah, and maybe also that there are online courses in development that will be available on MOOC platforms, so on Moodle and on FutureLearn, which are quite which are not directed at a particular a professional audience, but for a which is accessible to a broader audience and
Yeah.
in a very nice and short format, and which introduces what you've been doing recently.
Yeah, and
I
director.
think if I may, I just wanted to say one thing about these difficult discussions, because very often we think that we can create situations that people can have a meaningful discussion, but that's not always possible. There are crazy people out there, and angry people. So it's also a skill sometimes to not speak up. They sometimes say the highest level that you can reach is not commenting on the stupidity on the internet. Uh, but I would like to emphasize the wise words of a Sufi philosopher from the 12th century, Rumi. And I always use that to inform my students about some important rules in respectful discussions. The first one, a rule is, or the gate through which your words should pass, is it true what you say? And that's already a very difficult one, because what is truth? At least we know that some qualities of information are better than other qualities. Somebody said it on Facebook, that's something else, and if you have a solid peer-reviewed citation.
Mm.
The second gate is, and I would like to emphasize that, is it necessary? Because sometimes people want to show off their intellect with all kinds of complex things, but it doesn't really contribute to the interaction. It is rather basically impressing somebody else. It can be counter-effective. And the third one, perhaps that's the most important one, is it kind? And I think practicing kindness is also very important in avoiding polarized situations.
And maybe a last question, so that we have in the chat. Did you evaluate the interventions scientifically, and did you somehow spot what if they're not backfiring or creating any negative effects and negative attitudes?
Maybe I can start very briefly. Yes, to the extent it's possible when it comes again to the experiences that I had so far, in two ways. One basically is feedback that we collect, and we collect it in an anonymous form, and specifically in the context in which we have exercises like that, is not just the usual feedback that students have to give, but there are kind of ad hoc questions developed specifically to kind of get not only what they learn, but also their emotions. So how the emotions have changed. This can be done in two ways, either simply feedback at the end, or even more interesting, what they think before they start the conversation and what they think after the conversation takes place. The other one is what we call debriefing. After the exercise, we tend to speak simply, let's say, to make sense of what we have gone through, of what we have discussed. And even there, I would say that it's very useful for students and for us to some extent unpack the experience they went through and really kind of to walk back the steps that they've taken during the course, during the simulation or the game or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to finish, so I would ask you to formulate a very short takeaway message for future voters and also maybe for future young voters. So what should they consider and keep in mind when preparing for the next election?
Well, there's one thing I usually say, because there's a lot of discussion about strategic voting. And I always say that there's an argument in favor of it, but you bear the risk that you end up with two parties opposing each other. So I usually say, when you vote, vote for the party that represents your ideas as best as possible.
Yeah, from my side, I would simply say, first of all, vote, participate. I know that's very cliche, but at the same time, if you don't speak out, if you don't vote, someone else's votes will count instead of yours. And the other one is still, I agree with Vander. There are a lot of crazy people around, but there are not still so many. And I would say that the majority of people are normal, good people with whom you share maybe 80% of things, desires, aspiration, but you disagree on some other. Talk to them. Try to discuss. Try to share what you think, what they think. If you really don't like what they think, talk about the other 80% you agree with. But don't basically close yourself into the bubble and throw away the key. I don't think that helps anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we covered the most important parts of what we wanted to talk about, and we presented your work in this area and how you create educational resources with the ambitious aim to counter polarization in a society and to strengthen democracy. Thank you very much for the nice discussion, for the very vivid discussion in the chat as well, and for the question. It was fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the project, what will come out of the project.
Thanks a lot to you.
It was a pleasure joining us today, and I hope a lot of people will also visit the website and follow what's happening.
Yep.
Thank you.